thought I'd see the day again, sir, but it is my pleasure.
Well, I will say this. It is, in our day, if you were to find us together on the street, we would be walking perhaps arm in arm and
Indeed.
remarking how charming we find each other, and then we would return to our homes and write scurrilous things about each other in anonymous papers. But Mr. Madison presents me with a particular quandary, because he is clearly a brilliant man. He is clearly a patriot. He was the only Jeffersonian president we have ever had. Mr. Jefferson himself, when confronted with such things as the Louisiana Purchase, or the Pasha Tripoli, or any number of military options, he chose the Hamiltonian way to go. You spoke of being a strict constructionist. Show me in the Constitution where it says you may purchase Louisiana. The simple fact is, Mr. Madison, I say with respect, you are wrong. The Constitution allows for much more than is enumerated in two fundamental ways. In the preamble, it refers to the government needing to take actions to promote the Union, to promote the general welfare. And most importantly, there is the necessary and proper clause. In your day, I do not believe too many would argue that your Air Force is unconstitutional because Article 1, Section 8 only speaks of an Army and the Navy. And so I think we can dispense with that nonsense. But Mr. Madison was a true believer in Mr. Jefferson's ideals, which again, the music of Jefferson is compelling. And what could possibly go wrong? The British burned the White House. When the nation is made weak because of idyllic notions, the nation is at risk. And only the accident of the ocean prevented the most petty nation in Europe from invading and conquering. So, Mr. Madison, I still consider him to be a friend. He wrote in Federalist 44, you will recall, sir, you said, where the end is needed, the means are justified. That does not sound like a strict constructionist, sir.
Well, it is amazing to me, sir, how much foreknowledge you have of events and ideas. I am in your debt. But I believe the opportunity needs to exist for these fine people to visit with each of us, or both of us, as you wish. Are there questions that you might raise? There's one down here, sir.
I have a question. I will say, sir, a gentleman would stand when speaking to someone of Mr. Madison's. Ladies need not, and I will be happy to speak to the ladies later, as is my invitation.
My question has to do with the concept of constitutional review and what the Constitutional Convention intended, whether it was intended for the judiciary branch to do this, or whether there was some interest in the states. I noticed that you said that the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were really drawn up against President Adams, as unconstitutional. And
I'm quite confident a question is coming, sir.
I can see why he might not be really popular.
Except I'm told with the ladies. But please, go ahead.
I'm just trying to.
Is this your dear wife?
I'm trying to understand what was the intent of the Continental Convention, the Constitutional Convention, regarding judicial review.
Well, I can speak directly to that. We didn't use the term at the time, but I believe I understand what you are speaking of, and that is, can a body or institution declare a particular law to be unconstitutional? And quite honestly, I had an idea going into the Constitutional Convention. I believe Mr. Hamilton is aware of this, but I called for what I called the national negative. In other words, I wanted the national government, and probably in the form of Congress, to be able to declare state laws to be unconstitutional. And I proposed that as a part of my Virginia plan. I didn't present that on the floor. We had Mr. Edmund Randolph, who is a much more grandiose speaker than myself, to do that. But the fact is, now I did not get that accepted by
But you only lost by one vote, sir. And
well,
it would have a brilliant idea. I compliment you on this.
Well, I realize that that's the case, but the reality is I, at the time, felt that the balance of power lay with the states too strongly, and that we needed a national government with both a strong Congress and a strong executive to counterbalance the overpowering authority of the states. Now, it was demonstrated, I thought, very graphically by Mr. Adams, who neither of us hold in terribly high regard, that with particularly the Alien and Sedition Acts that Congress passed at his suggestion and that he signed, that these were unconstitutional. And no one challenged that, and it was not yet established at that time that it would be the Supreme Court that might do that. Leave it to a Federalist, however, to come to that conclusion. I believe Mr. John Marshall, who's the current Chief Justice, has jumped to that conclusion. I had my own little confrontations with Mr. Marshall in a situation called Marbury versus Madison. But that's another story for another day.
I would love to tell it.
I'm sure you would, sir, in a memorable way. But other questions? I don't. Did we
May I
deal
follow
with that
briefly?
essentially? You may do that, sir.
The notion of judicial review was, I am credited in your day as the inventor of it, although I think the laws of Blackstone in England created a layer for this. But there must be some element that can negate an error of Congress. And this notion of judicial activism, in your day, it's mind-numbing to some degree, because all that judicial activism means in your day is a judge who decides something you disagree with. Your current Supreme Court has made rulings, whether you agree or disagree, that change 100 years of precedent. If you support them, you say they are being true to the Constitution. If you disagree, they are being activists. But fundamentally, judges must be activists, because men in Congress will pass unjust laws. There must be something beyond election, beyond repeal, other than impeachment, that can be the arbiter of the Constitution itself. Without it, what value is the Constitution at all?
Well, you were in the Constitutional Convention as well.
I was.
And the question is, what solution did that group of men come up with for dealing with a law of Congress?
I would say, first of all, that I would not claim that we anticipated every possible problem. I think the 12th Amendment is an example of where we fell short on our envisioning of future challenges.
Well, one could say the entire Bill of Rights, sir.
I would say so. I would argue against the Bill of Rights if that question comes up. But I would say, sir, I don't believe we spent a great deal of time specifically addressing that issue beyond the notion as Mr. Madison has outlined. I was a strong supporter of this notion of nullification of a state's law. Think of your own civil rights movement, how easy, much more easier that would have been. And Mr. Madison also did another service to the nation that I wish to compliment him on. In theory, these proceedings were to be secret. The windows were drawn, curtains were pulled. This was between May and September. It was very hot in Philadelphia. Within a block of the hall, the cobblestones were covered with sawdust so that the footfalls of the horses did not disturb us. Mr. Madison there was supposed to be no record so that we could all speak freely, but Mr. Madison kept very nearly a verbatim transcript. And on the 18th of June, 1787, I gave a 5-hour speech. I think it nearly
You
killed
certainly
you,
did, sir, and I was exhausted.
I believe he was praying for ambidextry. Other
But,
questions?
but it was such a radical notion that we could use it later. Yes, sir.
Indeed.
I believe George Mason was the originator of the first 10 amendments. He refused to sign your Constitution because it didn't have it in there. What was the arguments against him at that time?
Well, indeed, the Constitution, you must remember the time frame. After the Revolution, or actually during the Revolution, we had the Articles of Confederation, which Mr. Madison touched on quite eloquently earlier. They failed. They required unanimity on any serious matter. Rhode Island, which we called Rogue Island, voted no on everything because they're bastards.
Careful, sir, you may be describing your own descendancy.
Now, I will say this, Mr. Madison. In life, I was engaged in 11 affairs of honor for insults. Had that comment been made then, the count would now be 12. But
Where's your birth certificate, sir?
I will tell you of my birth certificate. I was born to parents who loved each other, but were not married. Because my mother, Rachel Levine, had been married against her will to an awful man who beat her relentlessly. She was 16. She fled. This was in the Caribbean. And she found my father, James Hamilton. And they fell deeply in love. But under the laws of the time in the Dutch West Indies, they could not marry. My elder brother, James Jr., was born. I was born in 1757. When I was 10, as I mentioned, my father ventured off on a business trip and never returned. My mother and I were taken ill with what we called an ague, what we today call a tropical fever. We were given the best medical treatment of the day. We were bled. I survived the treatment and she did not. Her estate were 32 books, 16 spoons, and a few other items from the general store she ran. But at this time, her first husband reappeared with my half-brother Peter. They entered the court, and they took everything. My birth certificate was a standard for the day, except that across the top was written, obscene child, because of the illegitimacy of my birth, so that I would never be allowed to attend school or be around children of privilege. And this is the core from which my values spring. Mr. Jefferson's first extant memory is being carried on a silken pillow by a slaveman. This must shape your view. Mine is growing up in desperate poverty on St. Croix, one of 600 whites on an island with 15,000 enslaved Africans. I grew up with a loathing of slavery and the commitment to raise my station. I wrote to my friend Ned Stevens that I wish there was a war. I'm sometimes called a militarist because of this. But a war was the only way a person of my class could rise. I said I would risk my life, but not my character, to exalt my station. Nettie, I wish there was a war. At the age of 14, I was apprenticed to a merchant. And within a year, I was running what you would today call a multinational corporation. At 16, it was realized that I must be educated. So in the summer of 1773, I went on the HMS Thunderbolt for New Jersey. I was enrolled in the Elizabethtown Academy, and the intention was that I would attend the College of New Jersey. You now know it as Princeton University. But having had no school except for a single semester from a kind Jewess who would allow me, I was enrolled in the Elizabethtown Academy, where I completed what you call your basic and secondary education in 9 months. I then approached the leadership of the College of New Jersey, and I said, I wish to be admitted as a student on special status. I will take the courses I wish, in the manner I wish, and I will tell you when I'm done, because I am more brilliant than
Aren't you
any
done,
student you
Mr.
have ever had.
Hamilton?
Princeton University declined my offer because of a previous student who had had difficulty in a similar program. And I attended King's College, now known as Columbia University. I did have one further intercourse with Princeton, sir, at the Battle of Princeton, and then I will withdraw. The Battle of Princeton. I was the commander of a battery of cannon, and the British leadership took refuge in the only building of substance, it still stands, called Nassau Hall, making it a legitimate military target. The university refused me. Battery of cannon. What to do, what to do? And on that day, at least to some degree, I achieved an admission to Princeton University.
My recollections of old Nassau were much more pleasant than that, sir, but nonetheless. Other questions? I believe we've almost exhausted you for this
I
man.
just have one question about Benjamin Franklin. He said, I give you a republic if you can keep it.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you expound on your views of that statement and his intent?
Well, especially in this particular case, because I am a democratic republic. That is my political party. Now, what that means is I believe in all of the people being able to participate in the election process as broadly as possible. I did not support the efforts by some in terms of property qualifications and such at the convention. But a republic is a place where the properly elected representatives of the people gather and make decisions for the whole. So as a democratic republic, we have the people participating in the selection process of those leaders who then make the decision that will affect all. That's what a republic has to be. It is impossible for us to operate as a true, pure democracy. That would be difficult enough in a group like this. But it would be impossible in a nation as a whole. But we can select our leaders, and they make their decision, and they will represent of necessity the variety of positions that we hold as citizens of the country. And so when Mr. Franklin, who I defended when he was our representative in France from the calumnies of the Anglophiles and the Continental Congress and such, and who I supported greatly during the Constitutional Convention itself. The fact is that Mr. Franklin had the great good sense to be able to bring us forth. Well, let me tell you, he proposed something that I would never have proposed during the convention. The tempers had risen high. This was after your 5-hour speech, sir. And
I believe they were all sleeping at that point, sir.
well, a day or two later, they began to discuss the things that you did. Well, he wanted a president for life. Can you imagine? Well, anyway.
I will explain myself in a moment.
Please don't say. But the reality of the situation here is that Mr. Franklin proposed that we begin our deliberations daily with prayer. Now, as you may know, Mr. Franklin was not a particularly religious person himself. But what he wanted to suggest was the fact that everybody was getting so tied up with their own positions that they couldn't hear or listen to anyone else. And even though his proposal was defeated, mostly because the members of the convention were concerned that if word got out that we had hired a minister to come in and pray over us, that we must be in a terrible mess. It did not pass, but what it did do is it caused people to think. And that was really what Mr. Franklin was after. He was also after that with his comment about a republic if you can keep it. Fortunately, so far, in spite of great difficulties, including that election of 1800, which was a terrible thing, mostly because of the Federalists, the fact is that we have kept it, and I hope that continues. Other questions? Well, we have one in the back and one in the front. Shall we do the one in the back first, please?
Thank you. Because my son and I continue to have this debate, if you could explain from your period of time and your perspective, what was the origin of and what is it meant to right to bear arms?
I believe we were talking about the foolishness of the Bill of Rights.
Having written the Second Amendment, madam, let me explain my understanding. If you recall, the Second Amendment is what is sometimes called an if-then statement. In other words, it says that there is a necessity, which is to have a militia for the defense of the country. Therefore, or then, it is necessary that there be no infringement on the right to bear arms. All right? So as long as this country has a militia, then individual citizens should have the right to bear arms. This was my own position in making that statement. And if you'll go back and check the wording of the amendment, that's what it says. I understand that it might lend itself to other interpretations, but that was the intent in the beginning. Does that help you, ma'am? Okay. And there was a question here.
I wanted to know what your opinion is of General Jackson. Would he ever be possibly
I'm sorry, sir. The question's
for
clear.
president?
We may have a similar position here, sir. General Jackson is not a man of humility, but then, of course, there are other people without humility. But in General
When
Jackson...
greatness exists with humility, sir, it is a marvelous combination.
And sometimes it exists independently. In this
13.
particular case with General Jackson, what he did after the success at the Battle of New Orleans, I think, is most telling, because he proceeded to take his troops east, I should say, into West Florida. Now you understand my confusion. The geography is a little backwards here, but I am literally speaking the truth. He went east into West Florida, which was Spanish. He did this without authorization from myself, from my Secretary of War, or anyone else, and proceeded to proclaim that West Florida should be part of the United States. He was a little perturbed when the West Floridians were not quite equally thrilled. Nonetheless, he was a freebooter above them all, and we shall see what will happen. I have no idea what will take place in the future for such a man. I understand, however, that a few of the Indians are, shall we say, less than totally pleased with him at present. We'll see how that plays.
Perhaps one more then, sir. Madam.
This is a frivolous question, I guess. But
Perhaps two
Dolly
more.
Madison really bake the cakes that we buy today?
I'm sorry?
I said, did Dolly Madison really bake the cakes that we get today?
No, I'm afraid that Dolly's cakes went flat. However,
May I pay tribute to your wife?
if you wish, sir. Did you know her? If so, we may have another affair of honor.
You know that my life ended in my involvement with Colonel Byrne. It was a difficult time. I mentioned my son had died, my daughter had gone mad. My enemy was in the White House. And Aaron Burr is Aaron Burr. But my wife Elizabeth survived me by 50 years. She was the last of the founding generation to die. She wore black every day of that 50 years. Became a great friend of Dolly Madison. Together they raised money for the Washington Monument, and they funded 6 orphanages, which to my wife's, to the age of 95, she walked 5 miles a day visiting each one. But I'll tell you one last story about my Elizabeth. Mr. Monroe, who I know is a friend of yours, sir, so you know this to
Indeed he
reverse
is,
your
sir.
years, was a scoundrel and a minion of Mr. Jefferson. I had had an affair of the heart. I was bamboozled by a woman who, it turns out, was essentially a prostitute. And this was a source of great embarrassment to me. And 3 men came to see me, Mr. Monroe, Mr. Muhlenberg, the Speaker of the House, and other, and came, and the allegation had been made that I had cheated on government funds. And I explained to them with the letters I had received from Mariah Reynolds that this was actually an affair of the heart and the loins, not of currency. And they withdrew, satisfied. A few years later, it appeared in one of Mr. James Callender's papers because he had supported Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson had refused to pay and get another bribe, so he switched sides again, published against it. And I was damaged by this. And it was quite clear at the time that Mr. Monroe was the source of the leak Years passed. Mr. Monroe and my wife Elizabeth are in their old age. And Mr. Monroe comes to see her. And she refuses to see him. And the children say, Mother, he's a former president. You must see him. And so she allows him into a room in which there is a single chair, which she is already occupying. And Mr. Monroe gives his speech about forgiving and forgetting and past abuses and grievances and time. And Elizabeth looked him in the eye and she said this, Mr. Monroe, if you are here to say that you are sorry, very sorry, for the stories and the slanders and the misrepresentations you made against my dear husband, so be it. If not, no passage of time, no nearness of grave makes any difference, and she threw him out. That was my Elizabeth.
And Dolly was in there somewhere. So.
She was over at Well, perhaps, sir, as my senior, perhaps I would make a few concluding remarks and then defer to you to the last word.
No, I believe that we're probably about reached the end of these fine folks' patience. And I would apologize for any inconvenience that you have.
But I would be grateful.
We do have a minute or two if you would like to make
I'm sure a summation is on the way, sir.
You need to tingle every day because you're an American. You have been handed a remarkable gift from our generation of liberty. The remarkable 32 words in the Declaration of Independence that begin, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," are the most radical words ever spoken. Because for the first time in human history, a people said government exists to serve us. And when that government fails, we discard it. This is radical. You are the sons and daughters of revolutionaries. You are the spawn of men and women who took up arms against the greatest military machine the world had ever known. Because they believed that because they breathe, they should breathe free. This is your legacy. Do not waste it. Thank you.
And I thank you for your patience.
Thank you. We want to thank James Madison and Alexander Hamilton for being with us here today. And now I would like to introduce to you the performers behind the characters today. We will start with Dr. William S. Worley, who is a professor of history at the Blue River branch of the Metropolitan Community Colleges of Kansas City. He specializes in American and world history and also geography. He's been presenting characterizations of historic figures since 1993. And Hamilton is represented by, portrayed by Hal Bidlack, who is a retired career military officer. During his years in the military, he served as the Deputy Director of the Air Force Institute for National Security Studies, was posted to the United States Department of State in Washington, and was an ICMB launch officer and instructor. He's also served at the White House as Director of Global Environmental Affairs for the National Security Council, and he spent much of his career teaching political science at the U.S. Air Force Academy. He currently serves on a congressional staff. Happy to take any questions that you have for the performers. By the way, this is something totally new. We've never done this before, have the two characters interact with each other. So I want to thank both of you for rolling with
Some
it.
of us didn't know it was going to happen.
Doesn't that make it even better? Even better, they did so great. So it's very engaging, and I'm sure you have a couple of questions for them as well. So please, feel free
I want to say
ask.
I do believe the Bill of Rights is a good idea. Do not let the air out of my tires.
Eleanor, right here.
Yes, ma'am. How did I choose my character? Well, there's a fellow who you may probably know named Clay Jenkinson, who does Thomas Jefferson. And he has a national NPR radio show called Thomas Jefferson Hour. Years ago, when I was still in the Air Force, I brought him to the Air Force Academy to perform. And I actually think Clay had just gotten kind of tired of the Jefferson worship. He would go and do Jefferson, people would just fawn. And so he kind of recruited me to do Hamilton. And we do debates. In fact, I'll tease it. Actually, Tuesday night I'm up in Greeley for the Greeley Chautauqua, but then on the 12th of September, you may know that University of Denver is hosting the first presidential debate. Well, they're doing a series of events running up to that. And on the 12th of September on the Great Lawn, there's going to be a Jefferson-Hamilton debate as a precursor to the presidential debate. And so Clay got me into this. And here I am. What about the character appeals to me? Hamilton has a couple of things that appeal to me. Among the Founding Fathers were remarkable folks, warts and all. I mean, I think that's true. What I respect about Hamilton in particular, I think among all the Founding Fathers, is his consistency. I believe there were other abolitionists among the Founding Fathers, but I think Hamilton was the only one who literally believed in the equality. He was trying to get blacks recruited into the Revolutionary War, and he said, I believe their facilities to be the equal of ours. Any difference is a function of our education and not their abilities. That's 1775. Remarkable. And then his consistency through life. He knew what he believed in and he stuck to it. He had a lot of flaws, and I think that makes you more interesting. If you're a perfect person, who wants to be that person? How did you pick Mr. Madison?
Well, because number one, nobody else.
You
was
look
doing
good in black.
Nobody else was doing him. And secondly, no, I think that Madison is indeed, in terms of American history, a very key individual.
Absolutely.
The way in which, one of the things I discovered when he was Secretary of State under Jefferson, Jefferson is often reputed to have been his own Secretary of State and such. But if you examine the correspondence between the two of them, and they're living in the same city, and in fact they're talking to each other regularly, but they went through the formality of exchanging written correspondence. And it's very interesting that when Madison is communicating with Jefferson, basically what he says is this: Mr. President, I believe this is what you intend to say. Now, if you trace that out and then see what Mr. Jefferson says, in fact, he usually said what Mr. Madison said, not what he had communicated initially to Mr. Madison. In other words, what you were really getting is the two of them together. And I think in many respects, whatever success there was, and there were several successes in the Jefferson administration, it probably came from that. I think the difficulty of the Madison administration, and I thought there might be some questions about, because his reputation as president is not as strong. And I think part of the difficulty is he didn't have Jefferson to play off of. He had Albert Gallatin, and that's not quite as much, not quite as that he's going to get from him. But honestly, Madison is very, very interesting. It's difficult, however, in most presentations of him to give him any kind of a sense of humor. And today I could hopefully put a little bit in there by having this as an informal conversation. He seemed to have been in informal conversation, very witty, like witty stories, but none of which got written down. Imagine that. But he didn't do that, in public. And so the way anybody normally talks about Madison is his written record, which is very formal and very boring.
Yeah.
So I have tried to put a little life into him, and hopefully that came across today. But the interaction between us, this is what doing Chautauqua is really all about, is where you can get into the give and take. And of course, with these two characters, as well as with Jefferson, there's so much that's back and forth. They're very much...
And it illustrates the key point, I think, of all of this. All the things they argued about in Philadelphia, you are arguing about today.
Yeah.
Big government, small government, rich, poor, male, all the issues. Nothing is settled.
What's the point? What's the place of religion in public life?
Second Amendment.
Yeah.
These are all absolutely central, and it illustrates what I think is a marvelous thing. When they talk about founders' intent, if anyone says, I know what the founders believed, what they really mean is, I know what a founder that I looked up believes. Because virtually...
Or what I think he believes.
That's right, what I choose to put in his mouth. But shall I tell you a dirty joke from 1802? And I'll close with this, and then I'll give you the last word. Hamilton had a reputation as being quite the ladies' man, and he fell in love with Elizabeth Schuyler. And this is actually a fascinating story because Philip Schuyler, the dad, he was a senator. He was a big-time guy, and Hamilton is this bastard from the Caribbean. But he recognizes Hamilton's brilliance. I mean, Hamilton, even those who detested him, Jefferson, as we mentioned, called him the Colossus. He was breathtakingly smart. He did law school in 3 months. Actually, I'll tell you, too. He also, just very quick. What I used to say as Hamilton he took the bar and became one of 32 lawyers in the city of New York, roughly 1/4 the number of prostitutes. And I'm told that in your day the ratio is reversed, and it is not clear that this is an improvement. Now my son's a lawyer, so it's harder for me to say that. But all the Schuyler women fell in love with Alexander, and he particularly with Elizabeth, but there were other sisters. And at this party, one of the sisters had a little bow on a shoe that fell off. The other sister scooped it up and pinned it on Hamilton's lapel and said, "There, brother, I knight you." And Peggy, the other sister, said, "Of what order? We have no Knights of the Garter in this country." And the elder sister said, "But he would be one, would you let it?" Whoa.
Yes.
I have two questions, but the first was, since you mentioning debates in the Congress, what was the debate about for the Second Amendment at the time that it was passed?
Actually, there was really no debate whatsoever at the time. It was considered self-evident. Now, the interesting thing is that, of course, has happened over time is that we no longer have a militia.
Well, in Jefferson's thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which part are you thinking
In terms
about?
of, Jefferson believed that, people need to be strong enough to bring down the government if the government becomes oppressive.
Right.
So that's another reason, it's an augmented reason to have Second Amendment.
Everyone needs a little revolution now.
That's right. It's thunder, wind, blood, trees, liberty.
So that statement,
It becomes problematic when you've got the 82nd Airborne.
So was that a major component then?
No.
That had really nothing to do
Information traveled at the speed of a galloping horse, and a high-tech weapon was a Kentucky long rifle. So it was not. I think I could say it was not considered an issue at all.
No. It was really something that was considered self-evident to almost everyone at the time. And of course, we only did away with the militia actually after the Spanish-American War. We create the National Guard in the first decade of the 20th century, which replaces the militia. And the reason they did that is because the militia didn't work. When it came to, they discovered in the Spanish-American War, part of what it did is it got you people like Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, who have, great reputation, but in fact were not. Yeah, exactly. And so in order to have people fully trained to participate in a war and have essentially a citizen army, we go to the National Guard. And where does the National Guard keep its guns? In the armory.
Yeah.
Literally. They don't take their guns home.
Absolutely. And this illustrates another challenge of the Constitution being locked in time with the strict constructionists. I am not a strict constructionist. I believe it's a living Constitution. There are a number of places in the Constitution where it specifically makes reference to something that made a lot of sense in 1787. For example, you get a grand jury trial if the crime is of over $25 in value. Now, in 1787, that threshold was designed for what? A significant property crime. Today, we are still bound by that same notion. So it's interesting because the Constitution, there's, I think, 26 different within the body rights enumerated, things like no titles of nobility, no bills of exchequer.
That
bills of
Attainder.
attainder, thank you.
Yeah.
But it's such an interesting document, and so it's really an interesting argument. Even someone like Justice Scalia, who is, or Justice Thomas, the strict instructions, wouldn't argue the Air Force is unconstitutional. As a retired Air Force, they can't very much. As I want to mention.
My second question is about that document, and that is, I think Americans are rightfully proud of the Constitution, but I think that it maybe as civics scholars, if you said, oh, okay, so could you name any other country on earth that has a really stellar Constitution that is promoted as another eloquent document?
Several, because they modeled on us. If you look
it has some originality to it. I think that
ours is the longest surviving written Constitution.
I think zero about any other Constitution on the face of the earth.
Well, there's the British Constitution, which is not a document, which is a very, it's a whole series of actions, and there's some written documents that are a part of it, but a lot of it is basically tradition and this sort of thing. And yet, with all of that looseness, if you will, the British Constitution is terrifically important. Has been, and it actually predates the American Constitution.
Hamilton certainly looked at the British Constitution a lot.
There's no question. But the other reality is that because most countries in the world have achieved national government since the United States has, the fact is that our Constitution is the model for most around the world. Doesn't mean that they all, went like us. And for example, after World War II in Japan, when in essence General MacArthur had, the opportunity to create any kind of government, what does he do? He creates a parliamentary government. Actually, it's recreating a parliamentary government that had been dysfunctional in Japan during the war. But he doesn't actually duplicate this. But it's nonetheless, there are many aspects of the Japanese Constitution that do come out of our experience with this. Does that mean it's perfect? Does that mean it needs to stay exactly as it is? No, and they knew that from the beginning. That's why the fifth article of the Constitution is there. And keep that in mind. They intended from the beginning for there to be change. Yeah, you've got the amendment process is built in to the Constitution from the get-go. Now that was not something they copied from any state. Because there were no state constitutions that had that component in it at that time. But it's a terribly important thing to get a hold of in understanding it, because we do have ways to do this. Now, we've also developed judicial review, which is another form of this, and Congress can rewrite the Constitution and in fact make laws that previously have been held to be unconstitutional, and if they don't get challenged in court, they now make it constitutional.
What power is that?
Yeah, there's a whole array of things that happens. Yes?
I think you both made reference to the capital as Washington City. Can you talk about its eventual establishment as the District of Columbia?
It was actually the District of Columbia at that time. But the phrasing that they used in that period was to call it Washington City. They did not call it Washington, D.C.
It was on the Potomac River.
Yeah, exactly.
Washington City on the Potomac.
That was mostly for New Yorkers, but nonetheless.
Thank goodness Hamilton didn't have a home state.
Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you.